So we're in Tucson for the Science of Consciousness conference. To my right is Katherine Peil, and to my left is Bernadette Ignacio, who is a journalist. And Katherine Peil is former professor at
Northeastern University.
And she gave a great lecture here 2 years ago about emotions and how they're integral to forming our realities. Would you like to expand on that?
Indeed. Yes, my mission in life is to really help recover what emotion is for us in a biological sense. It is this incredible regulatory guidance system. Mm-hmm. It's literally a sensory system that was the very first to have emerged. And we've missed it because the original qualia is something akin to pleasure and pain, and it was, I argue, way back with the emergence of life. Mm-hmm. And it allowed just the experience, the binary signaling of something like pleasure, something like pain, allowed the organism to sample and evaluate its environment and adapt accordingly. And in my research, I did my research at Harvard Divinity School, so if you're looking for an affiliation, I'm still, they're deep in my heart there. But the thing is that when you look to the chemistry of the sensory motor system on the cellular membrane of the E. coli bacterium, you find this beautiful molecular machinery that drives its hedonic behavior toward that which is beneficial and away from that which is harmful.
So that's kind of in line with what Stuart Hameroff was saying, that we're guided by the pleasure principle.
Yeah, in fact, he got that from me.
Yeah.
Not seriously. Stuart and a whole bunch of us were participating on a listserv about these. I mean, there were a lot of wonderful people on it, including Henry Stapp and Deepak Chopra. And I started talking about emotion, and Stuart got really interested, and I sent him my papers, and he immediately the pleasure principle. Mm-hmm. So he wrote that paper, and he cites me in it, like the very beginning. I kind of go company with him a little bit because he talks about Freud's pleasure principle, and I like to kind of keep Freud out of the equation. However, he was right about there being levels of our emotional experience that are hardwired and are below our level of conscious awareness unless we're paying attention.
Now, I spoke with Bruce Damer yesterday, and we came to an agreement that events like this are so cerebral and full of people just kind of clash of intellects that people forget to live from their hearts. And I really loved your talk 2 years ago. Maybe Bernadette could add to that.
Yeah, I was in the space of feeling frustrated. That was my emotion, with how much brilliance is being presented without, how shall I say, people explaining the impact
and implications, like for the present, here, the now, all of the problems in the world.
As you said, Josh, it's very cerebral, but we're so much more than just our brains. Of course, it's mediating our experiences, but at the same time, in conjunction with that mediation of emotion, which is a driving force. So where do you feel like you stand on integrating that more with the intellectual side of how important this work is?
Well, to me, science is a spiritual pursuit, and my life experiences led me to the centerpiece of emotion being the sort of ground zero for everything horrible and everything human and everything wonderful about being human. So I wanted to understand what it was about. I'd had quite a bit of experience in the real world, and a lot of academians don't get that. They get on a trajectory, and rightly so. You know, you do really well in school, you get opportunities, and you stay, and you never really have those opportunities. So I brought with me a kind of a burning passion to understand some of the deeper problems and how to fix them. And so I'm a pragmatist that way, and I only spent, well, I mean, I love the science anyway, but I was going into practical applications way back in the late 90s because I didn't have opportunities to go on, and so I started my own nonprofit to do it. But I took it right to the streets, people that were in really intense 12-step programs. They were trying to recover from these all horrible situations. A lot of them were young and damaged, and one of them had an electronic collar, one gone through a windshield. I mean, these are people that really need some kind of guidance. So I put together this little self-help manual, and I was teaching it to them, which is, by the way, it's still on my website. It's funky, it's a little dated, but I'm still proud of the graphics of the day, and I made them. But there's a lot of really good, useful, how-to, pragmatic information in that little booklet. So, and then I got sort of discovered and pulled back into the science. I was involved in the very beginning of the positive psychology movement, and then it occurred to me that a lot of what they were talking about, they were all excited about, the discovery of positive emotions, there's all this good stuff about them, because they'd sort of been left out of the inquiry with a few notable exceptions, but that they weren't acknowledging the role of the negative emotions, how they work together. So my mentor, Marty Seligman, as a favor to him, even though it pissed him off, because he wanted me to narrow my focus down and talk about, emotion and how it mediates cooperative versus competitive behavior, which was one of the themes of the stuff that he had read of mine that he really liked. But I wanted to go and find out what the function was. Where did positive and negative come from? Where does this? Because it's an evaluative mechanism of some sort. So I sort of parted company with him to go back and do interdisciplinary research instead. And they're still having trouble because they haven't integrated the negative emotions.
Sure.
Do you want to?
Yeah, so in the state of affairs as they are now, I mean, I feel that it's more important than ever to understand how...
Are you thinking the T word?
Well, that, and of course, the aspects of the planet that are deteriorating, aspects of technology, and how that may have some potential negative effects on the next generation coming up in terms of these screen addictions, different aspects of
automatic weapons.
Right, I feel that it's important to understand how these apparently negative effects or negative emotions are really going to play themselves out in terms of not just the positive, but really, what are the outcomes of this, or what could the outcomes of this be?
So I discussed with your husband, Stu Kaufman, yesterday that humanity seems to be adhere to the Newtonian Mechanical, the reductionist, materialist, scientist worldview, and that has led us to a crisis, and we're on the very threshold of late capitalism, and we need a drastic paradigm shift for a sustainable future. And in my view, I think we've advanced way too much on the scientific and technological front, and we should have kind of maybe stayed around the level of the Renaissance period.
Oh, is that what you meant?
Which might not be so appealing to some people, because I think the majority of Western Europe were peasant farmers. But we certainly were more in line with nature.
Sustainability, and sure. I see what you mean, and I kind of, I agree with that, because the whole thing about the emotional system is there are things that were completely overlooked by science, that were taken to town by religion, that are wrong. They're just wrong. And a lot of, that's why I took the time to do the science, because there really is a biological logic encoded in positive and negative emotion that is completely missing from our understanding of who we are as people, how we relate to one another, why we have competitive impulses, why we have cooperative impulses, when it's right to fight and take flight, and when it's wrong to fight and take flight. We actually evolved something called right responses, that's what I call them, a long time ago, because negative emotion gets blamed for being sin and everything else because of the fight and flight behavioral impulses. And they're so powerful that, if you've ever gotten in a fight with your boyfriend, you know that, the love's there somewhere, but it sure isn't there in that moment.
Sure.
So it's like, but there's a reason that those negative emotions take priority. They're about bodily self-preservation, and they have the same evaluative logic for all living systems.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to the 4 basic negative emotions, fear, anger, disgust, and sadness, they're the same meaning for everyone. Mm-hmm. And this is where we can have like a universal ethic, that we need to have a global ethic. We live in a global community in every possible way, and we live in an interdependent biosphere. A lot of what we're doing in killing our planet and the soil and the other creatures, it's self-destructive. We cannot live without it. So the whole idea that we have this self-regulatory sense that tells us how to preserve our body by changing things in our environment, not just by fighting or running away, but by creating culture and communicating. Those are right responses. Learning, communicating, creating culture. And we do that way more than we fight or take flight, but we don't realize it's because of how our negative and positive emotions are working together that we're doing all these things. Mm-hmm. And we don't give it any credit, and we don't give ourselves the credit or the accountability that self-regulation demands. And yet it's the fundamental principle of all living systems, from the cellular level all the way to the social level. So there are a couple of things in particular. The talk that I gave a couple of days ago, I'm sorry you guys missed it. This is just a weird conference, I have to say. There was enough miscommunication, and the way that anyway, it was a pretty good talk, and I focused this time. I didn't have quite as much time, but I focused this time on how the concept of self-organization and emergent structures gives rise to helping us understand the self-regulatory function of emotion. So it was really pretty cool, and I talked about emotion as feedback signals, which is what they are, of both cybernetic at the individual level and social, which is how complex systems, simple rules at the local level give rise to global behavior. The simple rules are what's encoded in pleasure and pain. Mm-hmm. So part of the simple rules, and it's also the feedback, social feedback, is how we get the nearest neighbor information for anyway, there was a lot of really good stuff in it. But the point I'm making is that there is this fundamental logic, it's a binary logic, that can be traceable to much deeper things, and we can talk a little bit about the spiritual component, and because emotion's all about the self.
So how is it a binary logic?
Well, we experience pleasure and pain, and it's the only experience that we have any foundation for saying anything about value systems, right, wrong, good, bad. Everything's traceable to that.
When you said binary logic, I thought about like the neural correlates of consciousness and emotions, and I don't personally think that it is like computational.
I don't like to spend a lot of time on the brain.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are obviously bidirectional pathways up and down the brain. In fact, there's communication all the way up and all the way down. Every bit of it's connected to our emotional system, which is entangled with epigenetic regulation, genetic regulation, immune function. Now we know about the microbiome, or all of this wonderful, 90% of our cells are bacterial.
Yes.
And once you realize that that's a part of our genetic and epigenetic regulatory mechanisms, and that the fact that there is this logic encoded in it that has to do with preservation of the body and adaptation of the mind and of the world, you get down there and you don't, there's no good and evil. Not only that, you see from the very beginning, even in bacteria, that the same molecular circuitry instantiates communication. Have you heard of quorum sensing? It's this
quorum sensing.
Quorum sensing. It's that when bacteria have enough of themselves in the environment, they emit these little auto-regular signals, so that they know how many of them, their neighbors, their kind is in the. And as soon as it reaches like a critical mass, they can switch into collective mode, and they ball up in defense against antibiotics, or they can launch a virulent attack against another. So all this stuff is going on as part of these are commensals with us. So we got the microbiome, you've got the enteric nervous system, you have the Well, there's the vagus nerve, which
Okay.
is
Yeah,
the
that's the
central
byway
nerve. That's the byway between the
nerve.
nervous system and the brain and the rest of the
and the
body
gut,
and all
yeah,
the
yeah.
organs. And it's like 80% bottom-up information. It's all this, but it's based on binary signaling. And there are computational things happening, but it isn't. The point of it is that it's switching between these binary states, and our direct participation in all that beautiful regulation is through our emotions. Because every time we're experiencing even a positive or a negative one, we're knocked off the edge of chaos, if you will. Because negative emotion is to prevent self-destruction, which is self-preservation is about order and stability. Chaos is actually, and there's order in chaos, is all about the creativity and the possibility and the flexibility and diversity. And those two things are balanced by our emotional system. It's just so cool.
But that appears to be neglected in mainstream academia.
Oh, do you think?
Do you think we need to do... I think was it you that showed me a guy that's working on raising emotional EQ amongst students? Someone at this conference showed it to me. So there's a well-known guy that started a movement for educating the youth on EQ.
Well, there's a wonderful guy by the name of James Goldman. Is it?
Goldstein.
Could well
No,
be.
Goldman. Daniel Goldman.
Daniel Goldman,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
emotional
yeah.
IQ, yes.
He actually popularized the idea of
Yes.
emotional intelligence with his book that came out in the late 90s.
That's great.
It was actually Peter Salovey that coined the term from Yale. I remember him saying, damn, I wish I'd written that book. But
It's a great book.
and it's wonderful that, got a lot of press, it cover of Time, all that kind of stuff. But it kind of fizzled somewhat because there's no consensus on what it means. But it
It can't really be scientifically... It doesn't fit the scientific
no,
method.
you need the biology, which is why I spent so much time looking into it. And so, I have my own, what I call EQ scale. It goes from 1 to 10, and it's basically how aware you are of the informational component that's afforded you in your feelings. Because there's complex emotions that are
How
perfect.
conscious.
Well,
How
there's
conscious
three
they were.
levels, so there's 3 levels of information. I mean, this is information that's at our fingertips that we haven't learned how to harness. And in fact, we've created a huge layer of man-made suffering and extra stress because, of course, a negative emotion has a whole stress chemistry. Distress signals with Hans Selye's original stress model had both stress and eustress, which was a positive. You get geared up when you're stressed so you can be creative, you can do things, you get your adrenaline going. But if it's lingering and ongoing, it's the centerpiece of inflammation, which is ground zero for so many disorders of the immune system, whether they're cancer because it's not enough immune activity, or things like rheumatoid arthritis and all the autoimmunes, because it's overworked. Because it's all part of the chemistry. They're called the
Right.
molecules of emotion.
Yeah.
And the body kind of goes out of sync and out of alignment, and then you get these physical ailments. The Dalai
And you
Lama...
get really depressed.
Yeah,
And you need to go and get these horrible drugs that people. A lot of drugs are about escapism, especially all of the opioid stuff that's going on
Yes.
right now.
The Dalai Lama, he often says that he's been trained his whole life in converting negative energy and emotions into positive. Now, that is probably beyond the capabilities of most people living a Western lifestyle, but I think we could at least learn to neutralize negative emotions, because otherwise they eat away at you and cause all manner of
Exactly.
health problems.
But the best way to do that is to understand what they mean and to decode this information and act constructively on it, because we're supposed to write ourselves. There's very specific things we're supposed to change. We're always supposed to change what it is. Once you understand exactly what those emotions are, they're the same for all of us. Like fear is about threats. So that means that we're supposed to reduce those conditions in our external environment that create threats. And we actually put more of that in there. We threaten one another and we do all this stuff. But that's what's creating the extra distress. We don't need to be doing that. So ultimately, the idea is we'll always have the basic 4 negative emotions because they're about adapting your body and fixing your environment. Those are always going to be there as the most important feedback signal to tell you when you need to fix this because you're keep it up and you're on a self-destructive path. But that the complex negative emotions are all about changing what's going on in here, what you're believing to be true about yourself, what you believe to be true about the other, what you believe to be true about how the cause and effect of the universe and all of that stuff. Those complex negative emotions are saying, dude, change what's going on in here. And that's why the most religious traditions have the true north of love and compassion and forgiveness and transcending the self is actually an expansion of the self concept, because from the very beginning you have both an autonomous, even the bacteria with the quorum sensing I mentioned, and a communal, social aspect of your very identity that's mediated by positive and negative emotions. So the two things that I think are the core to a new sort of renaissance, a new idea about our humanity and who we are with one another is, first of all, us versus them is not true.
Okay, thanks for bringing that up. It's something that I was thinking about as you were speaking, when perhaps people on a massive scale could be experiencing those mixed signals of what the positive feedback could be for experiencing a negative emotion.
Exactly. Well, there's information. It's like, hey, it's very specific. You're supposed to fix this. And one of the ideas that we've adapted and have spuriously accepted as part of almost every culture is this idea of us versus them. And of course we have stranger, wariness and all of that that's built into our own kind of defensive mode. But the more interaction you have with the other, that's of course what diversity training is about and all of that. But that your sense of self is more complete when you're empathically connected to the other. But
by the other, do you mean strangers or other aspects of your identity?
I mean the other people.
Okay. Yeah, I was explaining to Bernadette, when we come to festivals or places like this, it takes a few days to go into like the hive mentality mode. But until that happens, you've got this like kind of fear and doubt and strangers and these borders, and then they dissolve. And you just feel much more oneness with everyone and more love and more heart opened.
Well, you're drinking the right Kool-Aid.
But I like what you said though, Josh, about the initial experience of your environment with several different individuals. Maybe it's a case where somebody's traveling and it's a whole nother culture, or it could be a case where a new neighbor moves into your neighborhood right next door, and it seems as though this biological, emotional tool set is where we can really just get practical about like leaving that sense of immediate protection not necessarily out of the picture, but mediate it with this pleasure principle as well as, pain principle. Like what's the potential, but then using self-awareness and self-consciousness about wanting to survive and wanting to integrate and wanting to be communal, because that's just the way nature designed it.
Indeed.
As opposed to clashing with what's designed and just keeping that border up because it's a societal effect of, media, whatever have you.
So in other words, we've got a lot of self-limiting beliefs and behaviors that keep us from community acting and just acting more on a holistic level as a species as a whole.
Well, it's perfectly natural to have those defense mechanisms. I mean, we all tend to, you get a big dopamine hit from being a member of a community. That's one of the really powerful things about religion, is it bonds people together in a shared sense of identity. Of course, then you're going to engage the emotional system anytime you can do that. So there's a huge push to form groups and then define, boundaries, and that everyone on the inside is good and everyone on the outside maybe not so good. That's the other thing, is good versus evil. And that is a false dichotomy. And those two things together is how we dehumanize the other. And
Right.
it's the pattern. Some people say, you look at our history, well, we've been killing one another forever, it will never change, we're fallen, we have original sin, which, by the way, was another really big mistake.
Right.
I have my own version of Genesis. I've written a little bit about this. But you asked about capitalism. I mean, that's a really difficult thing to take apart, because the free market is absolutely, we're self-regulating creatures.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have the agency and empowerment to be who we are. We're not all the same. There should never be, some sort of expectation of equal outcome, but there should be equal opportunity. And I wrote there's a couple of chapters for a series of books that should be published soon. When I was working with people that are doing conflict mediation and social justice and this kind of stuff, I find that really rewarding. But I did this little piece called the body politic, and saying if we look at how nature has answered certain questions, like control, for example. When you look at the brain, it is sort of the central controller, but it's more of an organizer, a coordinator, an enabler of all of the other levels of control that are going on. And so the emergence idea is that each level emerges because of the parts, but it feeds back to constrain them in ways that whatever happened to make this new level stays preserved. That's the self-preservation and the stability versus the creativity and the emergence self-organization. So with this idea of the body proper, I had a lot of fun doing it. It was mostly just my own intuitions, but it was backed up with how the body is designed. And okay,
Yes.
the immune system does this, and this is how we should think about our military or something. And I likened our economy to the circulatory system, in that if you don't have enough empowerment, money is what is going to allow us to meet all of our needs. And so you've got to have the blood go all the way out to the very smallest, the little capillaries all the way out. That doesn't mean that everybody needs as much blood as what's going through the aorta, but they do need it enough to survive. So just that kind of way of thinking about how to resolve this. And by the way, the right and the left is all about
Hemisphere of the brain, you mean?
Well, no, that politically.
Okay.
Right.
The right versus the left is all about this misunderstanding that we have dual identity components. We have an
Right.
autonomous agent, and it's mediated by the self-preserving. You wouldn't want to be a member of a group if they enslaved you, right? That's why you get pissed off, right? So, anchor's really important that way. So they're right. Those things have to kind of come first, but you don't just throw away the baby of collectivism with the bathwater, because no
Right.
one is born an autonomous agent. You need to go through a very specific developmental set of, and in fact, if you don't have the right kind of nurturing and the right kind of opportunities, you literally don't have the right brain structure.
So Katherine, in the age that we live in, highly technical, as you said, Josh, just advancing technologically, scientifically, and the matter of things, like physical matter of technology is increasing, and our interface with it is increasing, and being that our biology is a feedback loop with our environments, and that is an increasing force. Can you speak on what could be the outcome and or advantage, disadvantage to maybe a lessening of this interpersonal human, interaction and an emotional developmental self as a conscious being?
Indeed. Well, I think do you mean mostly like computer technology?
Yes,
and
mostly computer
social,
technologies, smartphones,
social
tablets in
media
schools.
Oh, my 4-year-old grandson is so much better on, that kid builds stuff in Minecraft that, I'm like, whoa.
4.
Yeah. And there's something to be said for the zeitgeist of your time. Like, as a parent, you're going to realize that, I want to give my kids the best of everything, and at the same time, they're going to be steeped, like a tea bag, in their culture
Techno
and
soup.
popular culture, and it's a really difficult balance to strike.
Do you think that maybe technology has become like an extension of our egos in a way? Like you've got your social media presence, and then like if they took away your Facebook account, like loads of people would just not know what to do with themselves.
Or even more
That's
to
funny.
the point of your field, an extension of like our sentience.
Yeah, well, there are obviously really great benefits to having an interconnected universe. I mean, there are kids in Bhutan that have access to journal articles that they never would have seen or known about, and kids educating themselves. I think that part of it's awesome. There's so many layers here, but
But what about this social phenomenon of social media and how that becomes the default way of
I mean,
connecting?
like a substitute.
Of
for,
course,
you know,
yeah.
The classic picture of everyone sitting around at the party texting, "Ooh, best party ever."
Right, and it's just what it is, though. Doesn't matter what age you are, it really is a highlight reel of all the good things. But there are people who use the internet to dwell and then share something that's deeper, or they are in a moment of despair, and maybe the only reach they have is for technology to connect. You know, I mean, there's different applications of how it could be a benefit, but how it could also be very destructive. And I just want to get your input on that
well, you know,
balance.
I think that's why it's really so important to understand these basic sort of dynamics of human being, because there are ways that the emotional system can absolutely work against you if you don't understand these things. It can be hijacked, it can be manipulated. I mean, we're learning now that we are consumers of information and that we need some kind of bullshit detector. We used to be able to rely on Walter Cronkite. Now there's fake news and alternative facts and all that kind of stuff. So that's a piece of it. But you're going to find that any technology is just going to give us more opportunities for these dynamics to play out. And there's always going to be the need for connection that's going to be facilitated. There's also going to be the need to handle your pain. There's ego defenses, all of that kind of stuff that's wrapped into misunderstanding how the system works. And once you can kind of understand how all that is, it's going to be a whole lot easier to see how it's affecting you in your own personal life and your children in their lives. And you can talk to them about it. Just, you know, engage with them and say, man, you know, we really live in wild times here. You know, when I went to school, we had to walk through the snow. And, you know, it's the different generations. I think it's really cool that you guys have such good family connections. It seems like you do. That there's elders and then there's always young people. The more of that intermingling and sharing of wisdom and remembering the humility of the human experience. We learn through trial and error. We need compassion. We want to be forgiven for our mistakes, whatever harm and violation we do to other people, stepping on their rights, on their boundaries, on their privacy. We do it all the time. We can't help it. So it's like there has to be forgiveness.
But isn't that what the emotion system is for?
Exactly.
You know?
That's exactly what it's for. So it's feedback, trial and error feedback. So we need to get over the idea that, you know, we're fallen, we're sinful, our bodies are corrupted. That's such bullshit. In fact, what we have been given biologically through natural selection or whatever is far more profoundly beneficial and of a spiritual nature, the guidance that we have at our fingertips. So that's why I have a lot of, you know, hope for the future.
On the topic of spiritual nature, the ego, in one way it's really gotten us into trouble. I mean, if you look at Donald Trump, he, in my opinion, he epitomizes like the collective adolescent male ego in person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like, you know, the word ego, I think, is a good word to use instead of self, because the whole Buddhist thing, and I love Buddhism, I think it's beautiful, but they do blame everything on emotion. Craving and aversion is the source of all suffering, and you have to transcend the self. What they really mean is that you need to expand your consciousness and expand your own self-concept empathically to its broadest expanse, to where ultimately you do feel one with everything, which is one of the most complex experiences. The fact that we're hardwired to feel that is very telling to me. So the idea of ego in my little book, literally in the book, I talk about it like this little beast that's standing at the gate.
Yeah.
He's sort of a little mechanical monster with a shield. He's standing at the gate. He's going to make sure nothing gets in that's going to hurt you. So I mean, it's part of our protection.
Yes.
But if it becomes a psychological protection. Then it, of course, denial. Then you have Freudian stuff going on. But it's really, once you start getting onto these patterns, you can really see people's stuff. It's like they're wearing their underwear on the outside and they don't even notice.
Yes.
But ego defenses are so, they're really obvious, and Trump is all about that, and bluster and pecking order.
He did
and all
have
that.
extreme trauma growing up. Relatively, I mean, he was physically abused by his father, and his older brother was an alcoholic, and he went through a lot. And people don't look to that; they jump to conclusions that he's just an asshole of a guy and should never have been in office due to the way he acts. But you got to look at the root cause of why he acts like that.
Well, not only that, the root causes of why he's championed as a hero. He speaks his mind. He doesn't get caught into the political correctness, and there's a lot more of that, even in the academy, than there should be now. I mean, I admire him for that. I think I have to say I admire him for jumping in and just surviving as long as he has, because his whole take on the world was so different than what he expected it to be like. And I think he's grown in the job. But yeah, it's the developmental process is profoundly important. In fact, you see a lot of, I mean, you look at the psychiatric disorders, and almost all of them are defined by abnormal, too much of this emotion, too much of that, too much of this behavior. It's all about hedonic behavior and emotion. Or it's sort of disorganization of other aspects of the self in space and time. So you get like your dissociative stuff, your schizophrenic, your autism, and it's just really interesting that these developmental windows leave epigenetic traces.
Markers.
And I mean, again, think about it in terms of evolution. Every brain is a unique phenotype. It goes through a developmental process, and the brain in particular is so plastic. Even twins in the same environment and everything, they're going to have a different brain. They're going to have different epigenetic markers. So we really need to realize that emotion is actually how we interact.
But is it? I
with
think
evolution.
That's dangerous territory to reduce like a kind of emotional experience to epigenetics, or to some sort of baseline genetic trait.
What do you mean reduce?
Because a lot of people can say, I'm never going to make it because I've got crappy genes, or
that's bullshit.
I've got this mental
There's
health
no one
disorder.
in this conversation that thinks that.
Yeah.
No, what
However, the
I'm
conditioning
talking
of
about
that
the really important necessity of understanding that a developing child is incredibly plastic and fragile, and you have to be really careful. You can't even take an aspirin when you're pregnant.
Right.
And if you're putting a bunch of stress chemistry into your body, it's gonna change how your baby adapts. In fact, what it does is it ramps up the stress response, because it feels like you're going to be in a stressful environment. You're going to need to know. You're going to be hypervigilant, and that's dangerous. And so.
The later life implications of that is something that I've been so interested in, because like you said before, you're even exposed as a being to the external world in the socioeconomic environment that you're put into. You're first experiencing that emotional environment in utero.
Yeah, you bet.
And then of course your genes are doing their thing based on those conditions, and then later on in life they will be telling of your own health conditions as a full-grown adult, and it's incredible. But that is an emotional field that they're navigating before they're even out into this reality.
Yeah, well, are you familiar with the sensitivity to context literature? It's about the critical windows and how the external environment gets embedded under your skin, it is through epigenetic mechanisms, but that even somebody that is in a socioeconomic situation where they're the underdog, that creates stress in the system that changes their brain development. I mean, think of what that means for our, societies where we have these really, really vast differences in opportunity for kids. And I certainly don't have the answers, but I do think that, first of all, understanding our emotions is a really important piece, and that looking to nature for the answers of how how the body has solved some of these problems, like central control and all of that. And I've never really thought about it that way, I don't think. Not very successfully.
Going back to genes, so a lot of kids these days, tragically, they're labelled as, having ADHD and dyslexia, and they're written off, and they kind of disregard their own potential for achievement. But then I've met so many entrepreneurs. Richard Branson, for example, I haven't met him, but he was bottom of his class, dyslexic, disruptive, and he went on to achieve great things.
Indeed.
Now, a lot of these people who don't have what are regarded as like high intellect or IQ in an academic institution often thrive and have a greater EQ.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of plasticity in the system. There's a lot of resilience in the system, and I mean there are certain developmental windows that you like. If you have some autism of some sort, and if it's really pretty severe, there's no turning around. Once the window's closed, you're SOL, so to speak. But there's also tremendous grace in the system, and flexibility and plasticity, and even adults that have had really profound awful stuff happen. There are things that you can do with the breath and contemplative stuff and good cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're changing those attitudes and self-concept structures that you have that can make a profound difference, certainly. But yeah, another big concern of mine is that they're medicating these kids.
Yes.
And okay, we think this is what, but it's based on a medical model it's not right. There's never been any even evidence for the chemical imbalance theory of serotonin uptake, all of that with for depression and all that, but it changes your chemistry.
My current research is on psychology and neuroscience of mental health.
Nice.
And I really don't like the way that people rely on the shortcut of take the pill and they're kind of brainwashed into that mode of thinking. And there's so many ancient, often spiritual practices, meditations now been proven to be extremely effective at harmonizing the mind and body, and all these other techniques. But you never taught that at school.
No, not even really. Well, it's better now. But I mean, Stu went to medical school, and they never. I mean, there might have been 5 minutes on nutrition and prevention, exercise, all those things. So it's like, again, we're self-regulating creatures, but we've given over the authority of our health to an external authority. We've given over our spiritual well-being to religious authorities, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work. We're self-regulating, and if you satisfy some craving, it's going to come in some more long-term form of pain until you really get what's going on.
I think there has to be more of a shift in emphasis from to prevention rather than cure, but we don't seem to take that route.
Well, it's with the advent of technology, and like you said, Katherine, the giving up of powers that are naturally designed within over to an external
our authority
source,
our ownership over our health.
Yeah. I've got a friend who smokes like 40 cigarettes a day.
Oh dear.
And he's got all these kinds of health problems, and like had a broken ankle and back pain, chronic back pain. He takes a lot of painkillers, and he's just like, screw it, I believe in modern medicine to save me eventually.
Oh man, how old is he?
37.
Oh man, seriously? Whoa.
Yeah, but a lot of people take that kind of approach, and they feel they're just like their body
they don't trust
is not their
it.
temple.
Exactly.
It's just like a vessel to carry their mind. Yeah.
Or a garbage can. I had somebody refer to their body, I'm a garbage can, I'll eat anything. Interesting.
Anthony Bourdain had a great way of, it's really humorous, and I think it's really well balanced in respect to all things in terms of our human experience and our bodies regarded as what people want them to be regarded as. And he spoke to some hardcore vegan of some sort, and he's like, this is austere guy saying that his body is a temple, and he's like, that's great for you, man. My body's an amusement park.
Great way of putting it.
You know, and again, that's...
You can take that stuff too far. I mean, we
Exact-
are organic.
yes.
We really are supposed to live life for the fullest, but to not be, I don't think psychotropic should be illegal. I think that that's a real big mistake.
Psychotropics such as?
Well, I think that people have psilocybin,
psychedelic.
ayahuasca,
Yeah.
That we should be able to experiment with our consciousness if we do so respectfully and without violating others. I think that just the whole idea that we have a self-regulatory biology and that it gets rid of a lot of the ideas
from nature to again, you know, take that environment in which we're blessed to experience and experiment with, given whatever you feel is maybe safe for yourself and for your own development, and put it to use.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that I did back in the late 90s when I started my nonprofit was I wanted to establish it as a religious nonprofit. I wanted all the rights of the other churches. I didn't want to be taxed, and I didn't want to, you know, I mean, part of big dreams here, and I wanted to be able to use and indigenous materials. You know, you cannot say we can't do what we want to do spiritually. And you know what I found out, and I still want to go back and fight this at some point, that guess who gets to decide if you can be a religion or not?
Government.
The IRS.
Oh, wow.
The IRS.
The IRS. You pretty much have to say that you will never say anything or do anything that's political, and that you will follow all of the laws. And that right there was a stopper for me. So I was really serious about this, and I asked them to disclose how Scientology got their distinction as a religion, because it was a big court battle, probably before you guys were born. Mm-hmm. But they sent me a big document like that all the way through. And yeah, so that to me is profoundly wrong, and that it really is based in the idea that the external authorities know better than us, and you can trace a lot of this down to the story of Genesis, that we're fallen and that, you know, God's punished us, and it's just crap. And yes. We have such an elegant spirituality that springs from within. Our experiences, a lot of it's been hijacked, but you know, just satisfy needs for like belonging and all of that. But it's
that always
far more elegant than anything.
Ruffled my feathers in the Bible that we're well, the New Testament at least, that we're born sinners.
And we're supposed to dominate the earth. We're not supposed to be stewards or members or participants.
Yeah, and we have dominion over all the creatures as well.
Yeah,
and I mean, humanity as a species has taken that several steps too far.
Yeah. Well, the whole doctrine of discovery within the Catholic Church was like, okay, we understand the truth. We've got God. You go out, and if you conquer territories, if they're pagans or heathens, you can convert them. But otherwise, they're yours. Mm-hmm. Discover them and have their resources, have their lands. It was really pretty awful when you look at the history of it. So I do think that we should go back to something like the Renaissance, when there was a more direct relationship with the environment, with one another, that we had a deep sense of local community, because remember, local behavior gives rise to global patterns.
And perhaps wisdom was valued over knowledge, whereas nowadays the knowledge is like, and the wisdom's perhaps lowered somewhat.
Well, I would hope that, I think you might be right. I would always like to think that wisdom is one of the virtues that we aspire to.
Well, people nowadays, they idolize all these multi-billionaire celebrities and gangster rappers.
And
we've got 50 Cent saying,
it's not even,
get rich or die trying.
Yeah,
right.
Watching the Kardashians.
Or
how about, you never hear anyone say, save the planet or die trying, you know?
Well, then
unless
you
they're
got to look
virtue
at some
signaling.
of those what would be anomaly cases, who are kind of these great glowing examples of what happens when, or what could happen when you reach the pinnacle of material success, and you've seen it all, you've had it all, you've owned it all, it's all been dominated, and then what? The Beatles, Jim Carrey, Tony Robbins. what's next? Spiritual growth.
That's exactly it.
That's the
And
next.
that's what happens too.
That's what's next in terms of their evolution of still being alive on this planet.
It's part of the
having
human
followed-
developmental trajectory. I mean, we really only need so much money to be safe and to be able to meet our needs. And it's not nearly as much as we might think. And in fact, I know people and have lived with people and shared with people who, when you're really on the edge economically, it brings out the best in all of you. You learn how to share, you learn how to
Go into like more of a tribal.
Yeah, and it's respectful of the resources, even when you have, like, Stu's done pretty well in his life, and we're not really hurting or anything, but still, there's always this imperative, as far as I'm concerned, there's a moral obligation to be careful with your resources, and just in honor and respect of the people that don't have them, and anything that you can do that can help their situation, whether it's through education or going out and volunteering or teaching. That's what's the most rewarding. And that's one of the things I like about Stu, is that he's a sweetheart, but that he doesn't seem to have as much investment in his own ego in terms of his work. It really is about helping. He wrote a book called Reinventing the Sacred back in 2008, and he was talking about, he got in trouble for it too, because he's a really serious scientist, as am I, but that it was a really lovely book toward this idea that we really do need to come up with some new way of thinking about our spirituality, because
More
of all of our
balanced
our
system.
tribalism. We've been killing each other forever, and so he proposed thinking about the creativity of the universe itself as God. And I think that's beautiful, but I would also take it a step further, that we're participants in that process.
Absolutely.
And that we need to acknowledge our power and become accountable to it, and that we actually have guidance to help us.
I love that you have that. It's very poignant about accountability, because, forging ahead in all of these dominating ways, what's to account for it? A depleting planet.
Indeed.
Which is beneficial for who and what?
Yeah. There's a lot of hope, though, like I said, and it's really wonderful to meet bright young people like you that are interested in solving some of those problems and getting down in the trenches and making a difference, as well as dallying with, these wonderful intellectual ideas.
I never said anything bright now. Everything's regurgitated from your talks. Everything I've said has been regurgitated from your lectures. So
But don't give yourself away on camera, dude. I hope you have a good editing skill.
But like he said, we're all participating, we're all co-creating it. So what you have to offer as an elder of wisdom about emotional development and
I like that. I am an elder.
You are. You are.
I am. I mean, it's kind of cool.
But it ties in with, I think, a lot of what we touched on in terms of a really great structure, but also a really great way to take that structure and kind of reinvent it or dismantle it. Meaning to say, we take what we learn, we get a cool, great emotional response out of this information, feedback, and then regurgitate it in a more relevant way, perhaps to the next generation that's more relevant to them and their problems and their challenges and their environments as they will see it.
Yeah, I think that's the thing about understanding human nature better, because have you ever taken a class in human nature? What is it? There's all kinds of stuff that we're steeped in as we grow up, but there isn't a coherent body of information about it. So if we can give our children just that standard understanding of what human nature is, then they'll be able to apply it in the context of whatever the challenges and opportunities are of their particular day. And that to me is a really important foundation that no one is really providing. And I'm really happy that there is this push toward emotional intelligence, and there are a lot of good things happening, but you really need the biology in order to get something really coherent that can be universalized, I think. So that, you know, the application stuff is how I kind of want to spend the rest of my time as an elder. And there's a guy that I was working with, one of my day jobs when I first started my nonprofit, really brilliant guy. We were both working for a government agency together, and he saw that little workbook that I had, and he's like, oh my God, this is exactly what we need to understand for sales. He was in sales, and he actually has his whole system now. He's about to launch a book called, I'm not making a book plug here, but it's called Sales Psychology 101. It's completely based on my emotion theory. And so, I mean, there were people that wanted to take it into the prisons. I wanted to take it into the schools. And I mean, so what I need to do is to come up with some sort of little primer. And the stuff that's online right now is actually pretty good. But what I need to do is make it just really super simple. And that's going to be a fun challenge.
Ooh, we look forward to that, or at least I will.
I guess we should tie it up at that. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. You guys are great fun.
Thanks, Katherine. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
and best of luck on your new project.
Thank you.
It's the most important.